Welcome to the Research Desk.
We are looking at one of the most deeply ingrained cultural narratives of the 20th century today. I mean, when we think of abstract expressionism, we hold this very specific historical memory.
Oh, absolutely. We picture the lone genius.
Right. We picture Jackson Pollock in a, freezing, unheated barn on Long Island in the late 1940s. We visualize him physically pacing around this massive sheet of raw canvas stretched across the floor, just violently flinging industrial house paint from a stick.
And we picture Mark Rothko standing in a dimly lit studio, methodically dissolving traditional forms into these towering, vibrating, almost tragic fields of pure color.
Exactly. We visualize Barnett Newman expanding the sheer physical scale of the canvas so far beyond traditional boundaries that it forces the viewer to confront the sense of the sublime. The narrative we are handed is one of pure, unadulterated artistic liberation. It is a story of the lone genius breaking all the rules.
Yeah, and the art itself undeniably possesses a profound existential power. I'm not denying that. The aesthetic breakthrough was very real.
It was a massive rupture in art history.
But the critical question we must ask today is not whether these paintings were powerful. It is not a debate about whether they were aesthetically overwhelming. The question is this: who taught the world that this specific visual power meant freedom, modernity, and universality?
Which is a profound shift in perspective.
Right, because what if the most, free art of the 20th century was simultaneously one of its most strategically managed exports?
And that is the central tension we are unpacking.
My position is that the universal status of abstract expressionism was a strategically manufactured reality. It was not merely discovered by a public hungering for avant-garde art.
You're saying it was engineered?
Heavily engineered by Cold War institutions, state-adjacent cultural diplomacy, and frankly immense financial backing. Value in art at this geopolitical scale is built. It is subsidized. It is distributed.
Look, I look at the exact same historical timeline and draw a fundamentally different boundary. The geopolitical campaign to export American abstraction was undeniably real, and the institutional architecture surrounding it was vast. I concede that.
But you don't buy the premise.
No, because we cannot confuse promotion with creation. The canvas fundamentally exceeds the campaign. To reduce these profound artistic breakthroughs solely to the mechanics of institutional power is to collapse all of art history into a geopolitical conspiracy.
I wouldn't call it a conspiracy.
But it acts like one in that framework. The phenomenological impact of standing before a Rothko cannot be engineered by a policy memo. We have to separate the inherent properties of the art from the historical uses imposed upon it.
Well, to begin untangling this, we have to establish the baseline reality of the era. If we are going to look at the mechanics of cultural prestige, it is essential that we do not veer into simplistic conspiracy theories. The historical record is completely clear on the sequence of events.
Right. The timeline matters here.
Exactly. The formal language of abstract expressionism, the non-representation, the aggressive physical gesture, the monumental scale, that was already well underway in the American avant-garde long before the Cold War cultural apparatus mobilized.
And this is the crucial distinction that clears away the most, reductive versions of this history. The Central Intelligence Agency did not invent abstract expressionism. Policy planners in Washington did not mix the pigments.
No, they didn't.
They did not guide Pollock's hand across the canvas, and they did not conceive of Rothko's chromatic fields. The formal vocabulary of this movement was forged in the studios of New York in the 1930s and 1940s by artists who were largely marginalized, severely impoverished, and struggling.
They were virtually unknown to the broader American public at that time.
Precisely. They were trying to find a visual language capable of expressing the post-war human condition. They were grappling with the collapse of European modernism. These canvases are not state memos executed in paint. They are records of profound individual aesthetic risk.
Okay, I accept that the creation of the work was autonomous. The artist in the studio is a reality, but the amplification of that work was anything but autonomous. We have to look at what happened when institutional power recognized the utility of this new visual language.
You're pointing to the early 50s.
Yes. Let us look at the year 1950. This is the year the Congress for Cultural Freedom was founded.
often referred to as the CCF.
Right. And as the declassified historical record now comprehensively shows, the CCF covertly supported anti-communist cultural programming across the globe. It operated through an incredibly sophisticated network.
It funded literary journals in Europe, organized high-level academic conferences.
And critically for our discussion, it sponsored international art exhibitions. Suddenly, the deeply personal, marginalized American avant-garde was intersecting with state-adjacent diplomacy.
And the definitive turning point for this intersection was the 1958 to 1959 touring exhibition titled The New American Painting.
We really have to dwell on this tour because the logistics alone rewrite our understanding of how art becomes canonical. This was not a modest gallery show organized by a few enthusiastic critics.
No, it was massive.
It was a massive logistical and ideological undertaking organized through the Museum of Modern Art's international program.
MoMA essentially acted as the operational arm for this cultural export.
Exactly. Look at the routing of this specific tour. It physically carried the monumental canvases of Pollock, Willem de Kooning, Rothko, and Newman across a highly strategic European circuit. Over the course of a year, the exhibition traveled to Basel, Milan, Madrid, Berlin, Amsterdam, Brussels, Paris, and London.
That is an incredible undertaking, moving massive, fragile canvases across a continent that was still culturally and politically fractured from the Second World War.
Right. And each of those cities had deeply entrenched, often highly skeptical artistic establishments.
Paris, for instance, still viewed itself as the undisputed center of the global art world. They were very protective of that status.
Which makes the presentation of the work so critical. We have to ask ourselves, what exactly did European audiences encounter when they walked into those galleries in Milan or Berlin?
Pause. Well, they expected to see a collection of paintings.
But what they were actually handed was a geopolitical script.
A geopolitical script. Okay, the concept of a geopolitical script is valid when analyzing the curation. But let us be precise about how these institutions functioned on the ground. Museums, critics, philanthropic donors, and diplomatic channels in the late 1950s were not acting as neutral pipes.
Far from it.
A museum is rarely just a room with white walls transferring an object from point A to point B. In this era, they operated as highly calibrated valuation machines.
Break down the mechanics of a valuation machine for the listener. How does a museum actively engineer value rather than just passively display it?
This is a massive piece of abstract art in a major European capital during the height of the Cold War. They do not just hang it in silence. They surround it with catalog essays, press releases, and opening night speeches.
They frame the narrative before you even look at the canvas.
Exactly. And critically, they explicitly contrast it with the rigidity of Soviet art. That is an act of narrative engineering. The valuation machine instructs the viewer on how to look at the canvas.
It transforms the aesthetic into the political.
By repeatedly displaying non-representational, highly individualized abstraction as the ultimate evidence of Western liberty, these valuation machines transformed a stylistic choice into a civilizational argument.
A civilizational argument. That's a great way to put it.
The presentation actively suggested that this specific type of painting could only exist in a society that fundamentally respected the freedom of the individual mind.
And the sheer scale of the ecosystem required to sustain that civilizational argument is staggering. We are not talking about a few rogue diplomats writing favorable reviews in Parisian newspapers. We are talking about a systemic, massively funded infrastructure.
The resources were immense.
To truly understand the gravity of this, we must look at the resources deployed. How much does it actually cost to engineer global soft power?
The financial mobilization was totally unprecedented for the arts.
Let us look at the United States Information Agency, the primary organ for American public diplomacy. By 1967, their budget was approximately $160 million. Let us put that into our current economic context. Adjusted for inflation, that is the equivalent of over $1.4 billion today.
Hold on. It is important to note that not all of those funds were directed exclusively at abstract art. That budget covered radio broadcasts, libraries, and international exchanges.
Oh, absolutely. but the sheer magnitude of that capital reveals the vastness of the ecosystem manufacturing cultural prestige. That money physically funded the international tours. It underwrote the massive, glossy publications that accompanied the shows.
It built the stage.
Yes, it sponsored sympathetic exhibitions and facilitated educational programs that embedded this narrative into universities. It proves a foundational thesis of the bull case. Historical value in art is not merely declared by a solitary genius working in a barn. It is physically and financially distributed.
The scale of the financial distribution is historically accurate. I won't argue that. But if we are to understand the mechanics of this, we must ask why this specific art was chosen for that distribution.
Because it served a purpose.
Right. The institutional adoption of abstract expressionism was not arbitrary. It was based on the art's ideological utility. And that utility is best understood when contrasted directly with its geopolitical rival, Soviet Socialist Realism.
The aesthetic Cold War.
Exactly. Socialist realism was the mandated aesthetic of the Soviet bloc. It was strictly representational. It was heroic, didactic, and entirely legible to the masses.
There was no mystery to it.
None at all. If you looked at a Soviet painting, you saw muscular workers in a factory, bountiful harvests in the fields, and visionary leaders looking toward the horizon. Its entire purpose was to clearly communicate state ideology without any ambiguity.
It was art as an instruction manual.
Abstract expressionism offered the exact opposite.
And that total opposition is precisely what made it such a potent weapon. The political elegance of championing abstract expressionism was brilliant in its counterintuitiveness.
How so?
Think about the American public's reaction to abstract art in the 1940s and 1950s. It was largely mocked. It was deeply alienated from the general public. Its total opacity, its radical unpredictability, its aggressive refusal to provide any clear narrative content, these were all things that made it deeply unpopular domestically.
That's true. Congress famously debated whether it was just a waste of money or even subversive.
Right. But internationally, those exact traits were suddenly weaponized as the ultimate proof of Western liberty.
The very difficulty of the art became its political virtue.
Exactly. If the Soviets demanded total legibility and ideological conformity, the West would proudly display opacity and fierce individualism. The viewer's inability to easily understand a Pollock drip painting was no longer framed as a failure of the artist to communicate. It was framed as a testament to the artist's total, uninhibited freedom from state prescription.
And this is where formalist criticism entered the machinery, cementing this political utility into what felt like aesthetic inevitability.
How did the critics function in this ecosystem? Because, they were not writing policy memos, they were writing in art journals.
While they were doing the intellectual heavy lifting to justify the institutional funding, critics of the era constructed a very specific narrative trajectory for modern art.
Clement Greenberg and others?
Exactly. They argued that art was naturally and inevitably evolving toward pure abstraction. They proposed that the stripping away of representation, the flattening of the canvas, the focus on the medium of paint itself, that this was the historical destiny of the medium.
A kind of Darwinian evolution of aesthetics.
Precisely. This formalist framing did profound intellectual work. It took a style that was fundamentally useful for Cold War geopolitics and disguised that utility as an objective law of art history.
Which is wild when you think about it.
It is. What had simply been one avenue of avant-garde experimentation among dozens of competing styles was aggressively rewritten as the definitive endpoint of culture.
And the cost of that narrative was immense. We cannot just talk about what was elevated, we must talk about what was erased.
The collateral damage.
By defining this specific brand of American abstraction as the inevitable destiny of art, the valuation machines actively marginalized representational traditions. They provincialized non-Western artistic movements, dismissing them as backwards, illustrative, or historically irrelevant.
They drew a very strict boundary around what mattered.
Most importantly, this concept of a formalist destiny obscured the immense political machinery operating behind the scenes to enforce this canon.
It made the engineered outcome look entirely natural.
The clearest embodiment of this entire process, the transition from marginalized experiment to global geopolitical asset, is the career of Jackson Pollock himself. Before the Cold War cultural mobilization, Pollock was certainly a notable, highly controversial figure within the downtown New York avant-garde.
He was pushing boundaries, certainly.
He was. But it was not yet the uncontested emblem of free world creativity.
He was famous within a very small radius.
Yes, exactly. It was only after years of international exhibitions, relentless critical elevation, and massive museum amplification that his work became global shorthand for American freedom. The physical canvas resting in the museum remained identical to the one he painted in the barn.
The object didn't change.
The paint did not change, but its meaning was entirely transformed by the infrastructure around it. Through sheer institutional repetition, his canvas became a flag without stars.
I understand the mechanics of how the flag was raised. I understand the logistical distribution and the curation. But this brings us to the absolute core of the bear case. We must vigorously defend the autonomy of the art and the phenomenological encounter of the viewer. The reductionism of the institutional argument is intellectually dangerous.
Dangerous? Why is it dangerous to simply map the flow of capital and influence?
Because it flattens human experience. A Pollock remains a Pollock, whether it is hung in a heavily publicized CIA-linked touring exhibition in Paris, or whether it is leaning against a wall in a neglected, unheated warehouse in New York. The physical property of the object is not altered by the brochure handed out at the door.
But the audience encountering it is entirely different.
That may be, but when a viewer stands before a Rothko, they are encountering something visceral. They are experiencing intense chromatic saturation. They are looking at vibrating edges and feeling a profound sense of tragic weight.
The emotional impact.
Exactly. When they look at a Barnett Newman, they are confronting the sheer physical presence of the zip dividing an impossibly large canvas.
But you are isolating that moment of visual contact from everything that made the contact possible.
I am insisting that the visual contact possesses an independent reality. These are intense, bodily, sensory experiences. No intelligent service painted these phenomenological realities into existence.
Fair enough.
And no curator's label, no matter how politically motivated, can ever fully exhaust or dictate what the viewer actually experiences in that unmediated moment of visual contact.
I have to push back on the idea of an unmediated moment. That visual contact does not happen in a vacuum. It happens in a room that was paid for by a specific philanthropic network. It happens in a museum that was chartered with a specific cultural mission.
You think the context overrides the sensory experience?
I think the viewer's expectation is heavily influenced by a catalog that tells them exactly how to interpret the silence of that Rothko before they even walk through the door.
The framing exists, yes, but we must not fall into the intellectual trap of totalizing institutional critique. If we accept the premise of the bull case, that every canonized work of art is merely the product of institutional power and geopolitical funding, we erase the artist entirely. The creator disappears, and the artwork is swallowed whole by its sponsors.
It does not erase the artist. It just accurately describes the artist's utility to the state.
It strips the artists of their agency. Artists in the mid-century were not compliant bureaucrats fulfilling a government brief.
Nobody is claiming they were bureaucrats.
But many were deeply skeptical of authority, politically radical, or entirely indifferent to the ideological frameworks later imposed upon their canvases. The chronological timeline is the ultimate defense against this reductionism.
Let's talk about the timeline then.
Abstract Expressionism, as a coherent aesthetic problem, developed in the late 1930s and early 1940s.
Decades before the Congress for Cultural Freedom.
Exactly. The artists were responding to the urgent, immediate trauma of their era. They were asking an authentic, agonizing question. What is left to paint after the collapse of European modernism? What visual language is even possible after the mechanization of global war and the revelation of the Holocaust?
The stakes were incredibly high for them.
Obscene. in the face of such absolute catastrophe.
A portrait or a landscape felt trivial after the atom bomb.
Precisely. This existential urgency was raw. It was authentic. It was absolutely not an invention of foreign policy planners sitting in Washington in the 1950s looking for a way to counter Soviet propaganda. The state merely exploited an existing artistic rupture. It did not engineer the rupture itself.
Look, the authenticity of their existential dread is not in question here. I am not arguing that Barnett Newman was secretly taking orders from the State Department.
Glad we agree on that.
What is in question is why their specific expression of dread was selected for global supremacy, while the expressions of countless other artists who experienced the exact same historical trauma were ignored. You argue that the meaning of the art is independent of the institutions that display it, that the power is just inherently in the paint.
Yes, I do.
Let us put that premise to a cross-cultural stress test.
I welcome that test, because cross-cultural examples actually prove the inherent, autonomous power of abstraction. It proves the form travels without the permission of the institutions.
Let us see if the data supports that.
Okay, let us look at Beijing in 1979, specifically the formation of the STARS group. These were Chinese artists who risked severe state punishment, including imprisonment, to exhibit experimental, non-official, abstract work.
Walk the listener through the physical reality of that exhibition.
They were denied official gallery space, so they hung their abstract paintings directly on the iron railings outside the National Art Museum of China. They were operating in direct defiance of the state.
Very different from a MoMA tour.
Exactly. Now consider the context. Their use of abstraction was completely divorced from any CIA export campaign. It was not funded by the United States Information Agency. It was a fiercely local, highly dangerous act of artistic and political defiance against a totalitarian system.
And you believe this proves the autonomy of the aesthetic?
It proves that they utilized the formal language of abstraction because it inherently resists control. It inherently refuses state-mandated narrative. This historical moment proves that viewers and artists can and do respond to the form of abstraction entirely independently of Washington's Cold War messaging. The power to disrupt is in the paint, not just the policy.
It is a compelling story. But I look at the exact same historical event, I look at the exact same iron railings outside the National Art Museum of China, and I draw the completely opposite conclusion. The 1979 STARS group does not disprove the institutional thesis, it definitively proves it.
Wait, how can an organic rebellion against a state prove the power of institutional engineering?
Because it exposes the mechanism of meaning. Look at the variables here. You have the exact same formal aesthetic language, non-representational abstraction, splatters, fields of color, absence of clear narrative. But that exact same aesthetic is embedded in two radically different political infrastructures.
That is the point.
But listen to the outcome. In Cold War America, abstraction was heavily institutionalized. It was funded with millions of dollars, toured across continents in luxury logistics, and celebrated by the state as the ultimate manifestation of Western freedom.
And in China, it was the opposite.
Exactly. In 1979, Beijing, that exact same formal language was criminalized. It was treated as a dangerous contagion of dissent. The police were called to tear it down from the railings. What does this contrast actually tell us?
That authoritarian states fear abstraction.
It tells us that the political meaning of abstraction is not inherent in the style alone. Abstraction does not organically radiate freedom from its atomic structure regardless of where it is placed. Its meaning is entirely, 100% produced by the institutional context it inhabits.
You are saying the paint is just a vessel.
I am saying the infrastructure defines the significance. In one system, abstraction is the pinnacle of state-approved cultural superiority. In another, it is an offense against the state that will put you in prison. If the meaning was inherent in the paint, the reaction would be the same.
The infrastructure defines the consequences of making the art. It defines how the artist is treated by the police or the museum board. But it does not alter the fundamental aesthetic property of the artwork itself.
Let me offer a structural analogy to clarify how properties and significance diverge. Consider the modern supply chain for lithium.
The mineral.
Yes. Think about the chemical, elemental properties of lithium. They do not change, its atomic weight is constant. Whether it is sitting untouched under a salt flat in South America or being actively mined, it is materially exactly the same.
Right.
However, the moment rival nation-states declare lithium to be strategically vital for national security and the future of global energy, everything around the element changes.
The market re-rates it.
Entirely. Governments suddenly subsidize its extraction. Corporations secure massive, multi-billion-dollar logistical routes to transport it. Financial markets completely re-rate the entire sector, pouring capital into exploration. Lithium is no longer just a chemical element sitting in the dirt. Its destiny is fundamentally changed. It becomes a critical geopolitical asset.
And you are applying this exact supply chain logic to canvas.
Abstract Expressionism underwent the exact same transformation. The paint on the canvas, the chemical composition of Pollock's industrial pigment, remained materially identical to what it was in his barn, but the infrastructure of significance was entirely rerouted by state interests.
So the institutions acted like the mining corporations.
Precisely. Cold War institutions subsidized its extraction from the avant-garde underground. They secured the logistical routes for its global distribution through the MoMA international program. The object didn't change, but the infrastructure dictated its global destiny.
Okay, that is a very sharp analogy for mapping geopolitical utility. But it utterly fails to account for aesthetic quality. A rock of lithium does not evoke human emotion. Let us trade structural analogies to map the boundaries of this history more accurately. Consider the marketing of a rare, highly prized tea.
Walk me through it.
The actual taste of the tea, its incredibly complex flavor profile, its aroma, that is the result of the specific soil, the altitude, the climate, and the intensive, generational craft of the farmer who cultivated it. That is the art.
The raw material?
Now, a massive global distributor comes along and builds a marketing campaign surrounding it. That marketing campaign merely determines the tea's legend. It determines its retail price point, which luxury stores carry it, and how widely it is consumed. But crucially, the marketing department does not create the flavor. The flavor is an autonomous property of the farmer's work.
But if the global marketing distribution network is the absolute only reason anyone outside of that farmer's village knows the tea exists, the legend consumes the craft. The consumer is tasting the prestige as much as they are tasting the leaf.
They are still tasting the leaf, though.
Think about defense spending. This is another way to look at how capital shapes creation.
Go on.
When a government dramatically increases its military budget, it redirects the entire industrial capacity of a nation. It builds new specialized factories. It employs thousands of aerospace engineers. It shapes the trajectory of the broader economy.
That's a huge structural shift.
Right. Now, the military budget does not invent the laws of physics that make a supersonic jet fly. Physics are autonomous. But the budget absolutely dictates which jets are built, how many are built, and where they are deployed globally.
You view the Congress for Cultural Freedom as a cultural defense budget.
The cultural diplomacy of the Cold War functioned exactly like a defense budget for intellectual prestige. It redirected the cultural capacity of the West toward abstraction because abstraction was the required payload.
To bring the analogy back to the specific experience of the viewer, consider the release of a film's director's cut. An artwork always begins as a specific, intimate vision executed by the creator. But once massive institutional studios take hold of it, they assert control.
They want a return on investment.
They edit it down for pacing, they package it with specific, focus-grouped marketing, and they promote a highly tailored version for mass audience consumption.
They optimize it for the market.
Exactly. And the general public inherits the studio's recut. But the existence of the studio's recut does not erase the historical reality of the director's original creation. The original impulse survives, even if it is temporarily obscured by the institutional packaging. We can still acknowledge Pollock's original impulse, even if the CIA packaged the tour.
I prefer a more organic analogy to synthesize how institutions manipulate original impulses: gardening.
Gardening?
Yes, the institutions of the Cold War did not invent, the genetic structure of the flower. They did not create the seed in a laboratory, but they surveyed the landscape, found the specific abstract flower, and decided to plant it in the most visible, heavily guarded garden in the world.
They cultivated it.
They watered it with immense diplomatic capital, they systematically weeded out all competing representational artistic movements, and they printed a massive bronze plaque next to it telling millions of visitors exactly what the flower symbolized. The flower is real, but its absolute dominance in the visual landscape is entirely artificial.
All of these analogies, the lithium, the tea, the defense budget, the garden, they all point to the complex intersection of creation and distribution. But there is a massive historical wildcard in this equation that our analysis has not yet addressed.
The limit of state power?
Precisely. The state, the government agencies, the diplomats, the USAI, the CIA, did not win this battle alone. In fact, looking at the historical mechanics of culture, they could not have. Government patronage is highly effective at creating temporary, urgent messaging, but it is deeply inefficient at creating a permanent cultural canon.
Because political capital is inherently unstable.
Administrations change. Budgets are relentlessly reallocated by Congress. Geopolitical priorities shift from Europe to Asia, from culture to hard military assets. To move from temporary state propaganda to permanent, unquestioned art history requires a handoff to the private sector.
Ah, the valuation machines of the market take over from the valuation machines of the state.
Exactly. We have to look at the collectors, the private gallery dealers, the museum trustees, the elite philanthropic networks, and the major auction houses. These private actors are the true engine of historical canonization.
The people writing the checks.
They took the symbolic geopolitical prestige generated by the state's touring exhibitions, and they meticulously translated it into lasting monetary and institutional value.
They financialized the prestige.
If the private market had rejected abstract expressionism, if collectors found it ugly and refused to buy it, the state's propaganda campaign would have eventually faded into a historical footnote. It will be remembered as a quirky diplomatic experiment.
Just an interesting piece of Cold War trivia.
Right, but because the market embraced it, priced it astronomically, and built massive private collections around it, the propaganda hardened. It calcified into common sense. The state may have lit the fuse of global visibility, but it was the private art market that kept the fire burning for the next 6 decades.
I completely agree with the mechanics of that handoff. The archiving of the legacy is where the real enduring power lies. Look at what happened chronologically after the 1958 to 1959 New American Painting Tour concluded. The canvases did not just go back into obscurity in New York lofts.
They entered the permanent collections.
The works of Pollock, de Kooning, Rothko, and Newman were immediately archived by major institutions. They were heavily acquired by wealthy collectors, people who, not coincidentally, often sat on the governing boards of those very same museums.
It was an insular loop of validation.
They were written into university syllabi across the country. They were endlessly reproduced in glossy textbooks that taught generations of students what modern art was.
The narrative became self-sustaining.
We are looking at a deeply counterintuitive historical reality. A covert, politically motivated cultural strategy only achieved the ultimate status of durable, unquestionable art history because an elite network of private actors found it highly profitable and socially respectable to maintain the narrative. The political utility was successfully laundered through the private market until it simply looked like objective, universal artistic genius.
Which brings us to the necessary synthesis of these two perspectives. The deepest truth of this history refuses to sit cleanly in either extreme. We cannot accept the pure reductionism that says the art is nothing but a Cold War psyop. That ignores the reality of the canvas.
Agreed.
And we cannot accept the pure innocence that claims the art achieved global dominance solely based on its transcendent beauty. That ignores the reality of the geopolitical supply chain.
The truth is the friction between the two.
Great paintings, by their very nature, exceed the political and instrumental uses imposed upon them. A viewer today can stand before a Rothko in a modern museum, completely ignorant of the Congress for Cultural Freedom, completely unaware of the 1958 European tour, and still be moved to tears by the tragedy of the human condition expressed in those vibrating colors.
I've seen it happen.
That phenomenon is real, but the afterlife of the art, the specific reason that specific painting is hanging on that specific wall in that specific major museum, rather than rotting in a basement, is entirely decided within systems of circulation.
That is the core of the synthesis, right there. Cold War politics did not just decorate an existing abstract movement with a thin layer of patriotic meaning. It served as a massive, ruthless sorting mechanism. It surveyed the chaos of the mid-century avant-garde, selected a very specific visual language, and amplified it with unprecedented logistical power.
It financed its global distribution.
And it exported it relentlessly until the specific, highly localized New York aesthetic appeared to the rest of the world as natural, inevitable, and universally superior. Politics did not necessarily determine what art was inherently the most beautiful or the most profound. But politics absolutely determined which art was granted the platform to count as universal.
The lesson is not that the painting was fake. It is that its universal status was built.
When we step back from the Cold War and look at the cultural landscape of our own time, we have to ask ourselves how these exact same mechanisms are operating right now. As we look ahead to the evolving culture wars over the next 12 months, whether we are analyzing the algorithms of global digital platforms, the massive consolidation of the film industry, or the fierce, localized battles over educational curricula, we have to shift our perspective.
We have to ask different questions.
Are we still just arguing about the isolated genius of the creators, or are we finally ready to pay attention to the infrastructure? Who currently holds the power to circulate, to label, to fund, and to preserve the art we consume today?
This is the Research Desk officially signing off.